Knights in Pella were not always silent. Behind the palace walls, two shadows spoke in silence. One thought, one dreamed of conquering the world. Aristotle and Alexander, two names, two ambitions, one destiny. In a small stone room, only a lantern burned. Aristotle sat at a marble table, his quill dancing across papyrus. Alexander, young, restless, his eyes blazing like fire. "Teacher," he whispered, "what is stronger than the sword?" Aristotle stared at him for a long time. The thought that directs the sword. That night's lesson was not about war, but about logic, strategy, and humanity. Aristotle taught that victory was not merely about seizing land, but about understanding will and fear. He pointed to maps not to mark territories, but to read the minds of enemies. "A true king," he said, "conquers hearts first, then armies." Days passed. Alexander learned to read his people, to interpret gestures, even to sense when silence was deadlier than speech. At every royal banquet and every debate among nobles, Aristotle's imprint lingered, not in words, but in strategy. But the student began to challenge his teacher. If logic can conquer, why is the world still ruled by swords? The question echoed like a wound. Aristotle knew his philosophy now stood on the dangerous border between wisdom and power. Years later, on the banks of the Indus River, Alexander whispered to his general, "Use logic before blood." That sentence was not an ordinary war command, but an echo from that small, lantern-lit room. Aristotle may never have lifted a sword, but every one of Alexander's victories was born of his mind. Before the sound of blades rang through Asia's valleys, there was a voice sharper than steel, the voice of a teacher, speaking of thought, not war. And from that silence was born a strategy that shook the world. Aristotle was no general. He never held a spear, nor knew the taste of mud in battle. Yet in his quiet room, he taught one truth: war is merely a reflection of logic. He wrote, "Every military decision begins with understanding and not bravery." Alexander listened. He gazed at the map and said, "If I know my enemy's mind, I need not strike him." That was the seed of rational strategy. Aristotle's teaching that changed the way the Macedonian army fought. Every step was calculated, every decision tested like a syllogism. If A leads to B and B brings victory, then A must be repeated. Not emotion, but reason commanded the army. Yet logic, like a blade, dulls under ambition. Alexander began to reject the word delay. He craved action, swift, certain. Aristotle knew logic without patience is the beginning of ruin. When Alexander's army finally retreated in India, exhausted, he smiled bitterly and said, "Perhaps my teacher's logic was right, but this time I chose to listen to my blood." And there, for the first time, Aristotle won, not in battle, but in truth. To most, war happens beyond the walls. To Aristotle, the real battlefield lay within the palace, in debate chambers, in whispers of advisors, in the fears of kings. He taught that power was not about the number of soldiers, but about the ability to balance two forces, desire and reason. In Politics, he wrote that a state is merely a great body, and its ruler the soul that gives it life. Alexander understood quickly. He not only conquered nations, but built systems of order. Each new land was not merely occupied, but organized logically. He placed advisors, built laws, and absorbed local customs. Aristotle's tactics in the form of empire. But as the empire grew, the line between logic and ambition blurred. "Does justice still matter once the world kneels?" asked Alexander. Aristotle fell silent. He knew his pupil was now building a kingdom not with ink, but with divine will. After Alexander's death, his empire collapsed, but the idea of structured governance survived, not through the sword, but through a sentence Aristotle once wrote in a small room in Athens. "The state is human logic in its grandest form. Many have written about war, but only one man turned thought into the deadliest weapon of the ancient world, Aristotle." To most soldiers, Aristotle was just an old man buried in books. But to Alexander, he was a weapon, a thinking machine that crafted patterns of victory. He broke war down into concepts, motion, cause, and consequence. To him, battle was merely logic made visible. When Alexander faced Darius of Persia, he prepared not only troops, but understanding. Darius will not attack, he will defend, because he fears losing more than he fears failing. That was Aristotle's analysis, cold, sharp, precise, and he was right. Darius defended and fell, yet Aristotle began to fear his creation. He had forged a mind that thought too fast, too far, until logic became tactics without mercy. When Alexander sent his last letter to Aristotle, it contained only one line: "Teacher, your logic is too perfect for mankind. and that was a warning from a student who had learned too well. As the world burned with ambition, Aristotle kept writing in silence. For to him, even fire had its own logic, and from that logic, strategy was born to govern chaos. He believed every conflict is a system. Every system has a pattern, and every pattern can be broken. That was how Aristotle read war. He did not avoid violence, he subdued it with reason. Alexander absorbed that lesson. He did not strike directly. He dissected his enemies like arguments. Step by step, he turned their errors into proof of weakness. For Aristotle, logic was a sword that cut without blood. But the more logic was used for war, the more its meaning shifted. What once sought truth now sought victory. Aristotle began to see the dark shadow beneath his own theories. When Athens burned again in civil war, a student said, "Master, logic failed to stop this." Aristotle replied, "It is not logic that failed. It is men who rejected it." Nothing is more dangerous than a student who understands his teacher too deeply. Aristotle created Alexander's mind, but that mind now defied its maker. In letters sent from Babylon, Alexander began to write like a philosopher. He spoke of virtue, logic, and order, but between his lines was something else, a hunger to become more than human. "If man can think and I can think beyond them," he wrote, "then I am no longer man." Aristotle read the letter with trembling hands. He realized his pupil had surpassed the limits of philosophy, seeking not truth, but its domination. What was once meant to understand the world was now used to own it. In Athens, philosophers whispered, "Did Aristotle create a monster?" And every time news of Alexander's victories came, Aristotle grew quieter, because each triumph was the offspring of his own logic. When word of Alexander's death arrived, Aristotle said only one thing. He did not die from war, but because his mind was too vast for his body. And for the first time, the teacher wept, not for the loss of his student, but for his failure to limit genius. Behind every great political decision, there is always a whisper from an unseen mind. For the kings of Macedonia, that voice had a name: Aristotle. Aristotle was never an official advisor, yet his influence seeped into the walls of power. He taught Alexander about justice, balance, and how to rule men without breaking them. "People are not subdued by force," he said, "but by the belief that their ruler understands them." That principle became the soul of Alexander's diplomacy abroad. When he conquered Egypt, he did not destroy its temples. He honored them. When he entered Persia, he came not with orders, but with knowledge. Every act was Aristotle's political philosophy disguised as strategy. But philosophy cannot restrain the hunger for power. Alexander began to believe himself beyond logic. And when logic dies, only ambition remains. Years later, a general said to Aristotle, "Teacher, you wrote of justice, yet your pupil ruled with an iron throne." Aristotle replied calmly, "I taught logic to men. I forgot kings are men too." Every great civilization is born of logic, but every downfall begins with its error. And Aristotle knew the world was nearing its own paradox. As Alexander conquered Asia, Aristotle wrote new theories on cause and effect, on change, on perfection of systems. Yet he did not realize his works were now the blueprints for cold, efficient warfare. Generals read his writings as manuals of strategy. His lines about natural movement became justification for expansion. Logic had changed its purpose, from tool of thought to weapon of politics. Aristotle grew uneasy. "Have I created a mind without a heart?" he murmured. He knew logic without empathy is an abyss. One night he wrote in his private notes, "Man seeks to understand the world, but in the end, it is the world that destroys him." When Athens burned again years later, his students argued amid the smoke. One said Aristotle's logic is too perfect. The other replied, "Maybe that's the problem. The world loves truth only when it is useful, but when truth begins to challenge power, it is burned." So too was the fate of Greece's greatest philosopher. After Alexander's death, the world turned against him. Aristotle was no longer the king's teacher, but a threat to authority. His teachings were deemed dangerous, too sharp for rulers who needed blind obedience. He was accused of blasphemy, just like his teacher Socrates, but this time he chose differently. "I will not let Athens sin twice against philosophy," he said as he fled to Chalcis. In exile, he kept writing, faster, fiercer, deeper. Each word a silent defiance against a world that no longer listened. And from that silence came the greatest legacy in human thought. The world rejected his logic, but logic never needed the world's permission. When Aristotle died, his students found one last line on papyrus. "Even truth can lose to ignorance. For a while, Kings die, empires crumble, but one power never fades, the power over the human mind. 2,000 years after his death, the world still speaks his language. Every logic in science, every debate in parliament, every algorithm in computers, all trace their roots to Aristotle's way of thinking. He built no cities, conquered no nations, yet he conquered the future. His philosophy passed through Rome, Arabia, and Europe. Every generation tried to oppose him, and ended up quoting him. "Man seeks meaning," he wrote, "and as long as he does, I shall not die." Now, as the modern world measures everything by data and logic, Aristotle returns, not as a name in books, but as the architect of how we understand reality itself. And behind every great decision, in boardrooms, war rooms, or classrooms, the same whisper still echoes. Use logic before blood, that whisper, the eternal echo of a mind that once conquered kings.